By my approximation, there's never any downside to learning new skills and gaining knowledge, but how do we best use digital tools to facilitate that? In this release of Building Better, we'll be looking at a systematic method of note taking, building from good principles and going into a few techniques. This particular release builds on the contents of Building Better skills, so please watch that video first if you haven't. I'm always trying to improve on the contents of these videos, so leave feedback in the comments section below. Part 1, First Principles. Notes serve two primary functions: to help us learn in the moment by clarifying and deepening our thinking, and to give us clear, concise reference material in the future. There's a healthy amount of overlap, but not enough that any one method can really do both. So, how do we improve our note taking for these purposes? Well, to start with learning, we want to make room for encoding, which is the process by which information gets lodged into your long term memory. Encoding improves when the information feels relevant, both in terms of possible impact on your life and similarity to things that we already know. Building up relevance is an indirect process. The most we can really do is learn from more information and work with it from different angles so that we know how to relate them to one another, so that the next piece has a good chance of slotting in. While we're taking notes, we want to attend to our germane cognitive load. If learning is like lifting, which it is, then the germane cognitive load is the weight and tension that's actually in the target muscle. Extraneous tension from stabilizing on a Bosu ball or holding a static position is akin to trying to ignore distraction in brute force complex concepts. We want to move up in what we call Bloom's revised taxonomy. We want to engage as much deep processing as possible, which involves active consideration, comparison, and application of the information that we're working with. Learning isn't the technique, instead, it's what's going on inside your brain. Before we actually start any studying, though, we might want to look into priming our brains for the topic at hand. The brain is efficient, so it tends to lock into certain grooves, which makes it hard to swap between certain tasks. For some people, switching the object of their attention is easy, but it never hurts to put some conscious effort into mental priming. Our brains largely prime through context and habits, so it can be helpful to set up something like a centering ritual. If you can change rooms, do so. If you can't, then take a lap before getting back to work. Associate certain flavors, smells, and music with certain kinds of activities. For a focused dose of mental priming, though, you can pre-study. This usually takes the form of skimming over lectures, tables of contents, and keywords while relating them to one another. I like to build out a physical scaffold and some kind of mind map so I have a visual depiction of what's likely to be relevant. I alluded to the fact that notes for learning are distinct from notes for reference, but you might be wondering why the notes we use for learning can't also be used for reference. Well, they can, but since the learning is done in the moment, you might find that the highly personalized notes aren't as clear a few weeks or months down the line. Add on to that the fact that you genuinely might not need to actually remember something until you actually do something with it, and it becomes apparent that you'd ideally have a set of notes for learning and a separate set of notes for reference. That's why we're a predominantly writing-based culture instead of passing on all our information orally. As a computer scientist, I am always going to refer to notes made for the purposes of reference as documentation, but luckily our personal documentation doesn't need to be as rigorous as code docs do. We do, however, want a certain level of specificity. Good documentation uses a consistent tone and writing style that might vary by topic, contains multiple examples of use cases and edge cases, and covers the topic in varying levels of complexity from the most abstracted to the most concrete. We care about having good documentation and effective learning strategies because they mutually reinforce one another. Deep processing and encoding improves the quality of our documentation, and having comprehensive references gives us a deep well of resources that we can use to prime our brains and build relevance. It's a virtuous cycle of learning. In the broadest terms, there are two ways to take notes. You can either take them as a text or as a visual of some kind. Nearly all information we're presented with is textual in nature for reasons we're going to cover, but I prefer visual notes for a lot of my learning. There's a reason why information is most often given in text. It stands the best chance at being safely transferred between mediums and is most widely understood. A lot of textual notes are impersonal, which makes them great for open use but less effective at the kind of personalized learning strategies that we're trying to build. That's where visual notes come in as another tool, one better suited to the individual but less effective at communicating complex, detailed ideas. It's not really that one style of note taking is universally better than the other, but that they have very different use cases. One way to differentiate use case is by what kind of knowledge is being presented. Returning to Bloom's revised taxonomy, there are four domains of knowledge, those being factual, conceptual, procedural, and meta knowledge. We're not going to talk about meta knowledge, that's for another video on journaling. If you're going to learn and apply the note taking techniques we're covering in this video, you should develop a sense for whether you digest these domains best through text or visuals. I prefer text for factual information, visuals for conceptual information, and a mix of both for procedural information based on how technical it has to be. Autodidacticism has a lot of pitfalls, usually to do with motivation, but the ones we'll briefly touch on here involve effort. If you are self-studying, then you need to put much more mental effort into it than if you are being taught. There's less structure, and the levels of complexity tend to blend together without a guiding hand, so I would recommend a practice-oriented style of learning with frequent tests and dives into topics a little more complex than you can actually handle. If you do choose to be taught in a more formal setting, however, then you have another set of pitfalls to avoid. Education can be extremely opaque, doubly so if you have a bad professor, so I recommend using whatever syllabus, course outline, or past materials you can find to pre-study for every lecture you're going to go into. You might also want to periodize or schedule your learning and review around tests and other opportunities for feedback, which you might find lacking in certain classes. Part 2. Note composition. Research has shown that handwritten notes are more effective when it comes to encoding, likely due to higher cognitive load. The students need to listen to the information, process it, and make judgments on what gets written down first and in what order. Handwritten notes, however, are really bad for reference. Digital notes, when taken linearly, are poor learning tools, but they have a lot of meaningful benefits. Standardized formats through templates to keep consistent styling, embeds, links, and syncing between devices make sure that notes are always available and are interconnected, and search tools can function on custom database properties, making sure that no information is really ever lost. What we're really looking at here is interconnectivity and customizable organization schemes. Why? Well, because it builds relevance through forced interleaving. Interleaving is a study technique where you switch between multiple topics or multiple ways of looking at one topic. Ideally, as information enters our brains, it begins as a puzzle piece with only a few applications, but gradually becomes a tool that we can apply to wider and wider ranges of situations, until eventually it becomes a mainstay in our toolbox for all kinds of problems. Interleaving speeds this process along as the multiple viewing angles encourages deeper processing. You're going to want to use Obsidian or some other plain text editing app whose data is stored locally and can be freely imported or exported. Notion is popular, but not what we want here. It's far too slow. To set up Obsidian, go to their website at obsidian.md and download the app. Once you boot it up, it will ask you to pick a folder as your vault. This can be any folder that you like and any directory level that you like, but I prefer making a new folder at my home directory. Once that's done, we can move on to configuration. In the core plugins, turn on slash commands and go to the template setting to designate a templates folder. Beyond that, it can be really beneficial to learn and set hotkeys for functions like quick switching, search, and the command palette, along with the additional commands that community plugins will add. In the community plugins section, make sure that restricted mode is turned off and download the plugins shown on screen. It's okay, but I'll pause the video here, I'm not going anywhere. We'll talk about how to use these plugins as tools to apply different note-taking techniques in part 3, but for now, just leave them installed and enabled. A quick tangent before moving on to part 3 to talk about the ethical use of AI as a study aid. Fundamentally, AI like ChatGPT are very poor teachers. They literally can't fact check and they stumble as you get increasingly more technical about the instructions. What they are good at, though, is creating outlines because they aggregate text from multiple sources. The best way to use AI tools for learning without robbing your brain of cognitive load is to ask it to generate course outlines and question banks at your desired level of expertise. There are AI tools for Obsidian, but they're more like shiny toys for knowledge workers than tools for learning and reference. Part 3. Orders of Notes. This impromptu hierarchy isn't really based on any sources, it's purely based on my own experience with a healthy amount of conjecture. Let's start with first order notes. These are primarily concerned with building memory and basic understanding. It's about definitions, intuition, and immediate recognition. Flashcards are an old standby in the world of memorization and recognition with question answer pairs, so let's talk about how they work and how best to use them. What you're seeing here is the forgetting curve, which is a hypothetical model that tries to depict how repeated exposure to the same piece of information can reinforce it in your memory. In the words of Adam Neely, repetition legitimizes. This repetition is best spaced, however, and flashcard apps like Anki and the Space Repetition plugin we'll talk about in just a moment can algorithmically set the schedule for you, which saves some mental effort that's better used for the recall itself. Spaced repetition is also a low intensity form of active recall, which is one of the more effective forms of learning. Generally speaking, testing our knowledge with immediate feedback is one of the best ways to actually learn, and flashcards do that quite nicely, albeit in a fairly simple way. Another way to leverage active recall is to leave gaps in our notes, but this is pretty risky, so I wouldn't really do it. The plugin that we want for our flashcards in Obsidian is the Space Repetition plugin. The code block you're seeing now is the default syntax for single-line and multi-line cards of the monodirectional and bidirectional varieties. Directionality in this case determines whether the program can show you the front or back of the card first. There are two options for structuring these flashcards within your vault. The default is that they are stored in a single file tagged with a configurable tag that builds a queue from the file's data. The alternative is to record each card as its own file in a folder that serves as a deck. Atoms are largely inspired by How to Take Smart Notes by Vicky Zhao, which in itself is inspired by the Zettelkasten system of note-taking. This is my spin on it, with the code block above being the source markdown. Atoms are the smallest unit of permanent information that I keep in my Obsidian vault, but they're the most important information I have because the atoms are where the connections live. If I wanted to be thematic, I could call these bonds, but connections is much more clear. The symbols in every list item are a part of the next plugin's syntax. Each atom has an abstract summary that evolves almost every time I visit it, and a body that contains quotes, observations, and my own interpretations of the ideas. At the bottom are the references, which link to primary sources in and outside of my vault itself. The List Callouts plugin will render lists that contain configurable symbols with an icon and color background, which makes it clear at a glance what information belongs where on an item by item basis. Within the atom, it orients outgoing links by how it relates to the current note, which builds up a web of relations and relevance to place our future notes into. If we want to visually distinguish the links instead by the contents of the destination note, we can take advantage of the supercharged links plugin, which lets us style links with prefixes, suffixes, color, bolding, and highlighting based on the destination's tags, path, or other properties. This plugin does require the style settings plugin too, but the setup is pretty minimal. Sketches are our first foray into visual note taking. Despite the name, sketches can also include simple diagrams and flowcharts. These are meant to be singular snapshots with pretty limited application for condensing knowledge down, but are invaluable in building up an intuitive ability to visually interpret textual information. The mind has an easier time remembering images than text, doubly so if the information is conceptual, so sketches can be really good for a quick capture of our thinking. There's nothing on the Obsidian plugin market that beats Excalidraw at simple flexibility and even extensibility, but we'll get into that much later. All that we really care about now are the shapes, lines, and freehand drawings. It's a fully functional whiteboard in your vault, and it's all stored as text, which you can see if you choose to open it as Markdown. Moving on to second order notes, these are a little more complex and oriented around synthesizing information from source material. Annotations are a step beyond the humble highlight. On a physical medium, these are notes taken in the margins of a work attempting to raise questions, summarize passages, and draw parallels between it and other sources. Here, though, everything is unfortunately linear unless you get good at CSS or pay for some custom CSS. That being said, we can leverage the callout whose syntax is shown above to make observations on a source material. PDF++ is a plugin that lets you copy passages from a PDF and paste it in another file as a link to that page while adding necessary annotations. Its functionality can be extended with other plugins, but this is essentially all that's necessary. Cornell notes have a pretty bad rap, or at least I used to have a burning distaste for them when they were enforced as assignments in high school. But I've come back around to what they were meant for, which is immediate synthesis. The point of the left column is for annotations of any sort, Open-ended questions, similarities to other works, and headline summaries all encourage a deeper level of information processing, and the summary at the bottom gives you the opportunity to exercise active recall and information synthesis, which will reinforce your learning and spot any gaps you might have in your own understanding. While the basic set of callouts that come with Obsidian are enough to make a compelling set of linearized Cornell notes, I prefer to use the Admonition plugin to define custom callouts with their own colors and icons. It can also be a bit of a hassle to remember all the variations on callouts, so the plugin adds a command that can list all the options out for you. Saves a lot of time, all things considered. Mind maps, when properly executed, are probably the best note taking method for conceptual and factual information. Less so for procedures, those are better suited for sketches, but that's not what they're for, anyways. Mind maps are pretty literal in that they are a 2D projection of your thought process with its adjustments and nuances on a sheet of paper or infinite canvas. A well executed mind map cares about two things: abstraction and grouping. You really want to minimize the words on a mind map, opting for structure to convey more nuanced information. What colors, shapes, and flows are you going for? What fits your mind the best? Beyond that, it can be incredibly useful to group information intuitively or by topic as a matter of course. A really in-depth mind map can resemble a map of content in that it's comprised of multiple smaller mind maps that still link and flow as one unit. Earlier, I mentioned that Excalibur can be extended, and it does so by using scripts, which are commands that you execute on selected elements on the canvas. Scripts are largely syntax sugar or a cleaner way to do something that's already possible, but I find them invaluable as tools because the change of pace allows me to really examine what I've written down and decide whether it's right for my goals or not. Moving on from the second order notes, which are all about the synthesis of information from sources, we're on to our third order notes, which are about how our information can build on itself. We can start with the mini essay since it's likely to be the most familiar to most people. Mini essays are basically exercises in condensed communication. Notice that I said condensed, not necessarily simplified. The goal of a mini essay is to create something of a condensed lesson plan that you could use to explain something to somebody else, and that won't always be simple. To keep things tight, we might want a word count between 100 and 300 with the typical 3-act structure of an essay. The point of the mini essay is to leverage the Feynman technique, wherein you teach what you're learning to somebody else. Framing the information for a beginner or somebody around about your level of expertise will expose your assumptions and any background knowledge that helped the information sink in for you, which should let you find ways to recontextualize and reframe the information in a way similar to interleaving practices. A lot of mini essays are useful as condensed pieces, but in the event that they can be more atomized, the Notes Refactor plugin lets you split your notes into multiple by heading, selection, or by cursor position. My note taking got drastically better after I watched this YouTube video by Nicole Vanderhoven. Blueprints let us emulate the functionality of a double-sided sheet of paper with a textual note on one side and a visual note on the other. This is facilitated by Obsidian templates and a hotkey that swaps between rendering the Markdown file as text or as a drawing. When you render an Excalibur drawing as Markdown, the data that encodes the drawing itself is kept under one commented out heading. By extracting this heading into a blank note and adding the properties above, you can create a template that can add a visual element to any note of your choice. Maps of content are like larger scale mind maps not meant to reflect how your brain understands the information, but as a structure of relation unto itself. While no maps of content can truly be objective, the goal should be to make one that's intuitive but more oriented towards navigation on a large scale. They can contain textual and visual elements with all sorts of references, but ultimately serve as a codified big picture for a given topic. Obsidian's core Canvas plugin is better suited to this kind of hybrid note than Excalidraw since it can easily embed the contents of the note on floating windows, which can be manipulated and even edited from the canvas itself. It doesn't allow as much visual freedom, which is why it's a poor mind mapping tool, but it integrates linear and nonlinear structures so efficiently that it's my preferred tool for maps of content. A big part of this process is in figuring out your particular evolution for notes. The way that you process information will affect what method of note taking you prefer and how it evolves over time, whether you transfer notes to other kinds, and by no means should you actually feel obligated to use all of the note types we covered today. You do you, friend. That's all the time we have for this video, so I hope that this has been useful, and I'll see you in the next release of Building Better.